my soul in peace divine. Peace that the world, though all combined, never can take from me. Pleasures of earth so seemingly sweet, fail at the last my longings to meet. Only in thee my bliss is complete. Only, dear Lord, in thee. Only in thee a radiance bright shines like a beacon in the night, guiding my pilgrim bark aright over life's trackless sea. Only in thee when troubles molest, when with temptation I am oppressed, there is a sweet pavilion of rest. Only, dear Lord, in thee. Only in thee when days are drear, when neither sun nor stars appear, still I can trust and feel no fear, sing when I cannot see. Only in thee, whatever betide, all of my need is freely supplied. There is no hope or helper beside. Only, dear Lord, in thee. Only in thee, dear Savior slain, losing thy life, mine own to gain. Trusting I'm cleansed from every stain, thou art my only plea. Only in thee my heart will delight, till in that land where cometh no night, faith will be lost in heavenly sight. Only, dear Lord, in thee. That's a great song. Good song. Good message there. 84. I think I want 84. Yep, 84. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Search me and try me, Master, today. Whiter than snow, Lord, wash me just now, as in thy presence humbly I bow. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Wounded and weary, help me, I pray. Power, all power, surely is thine. Touch me and heal me, Savior divine. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. O Lord, my being, absolute sway. Fill with thy spirit till all shall see Christ only, always living in me. Chad, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the opportunity that we have to come here. We thank you for your word, and we thank you that we have the chance to sing songs of praise to you. And as we go through this time of worship, we ask that you be with us, that you be with Brother Wade as he teaches the lesson, and that you open our hearts and minds that we can take what we learn here and apply it to our lives, to walk better among the world as Christians, and to let your light shine through us. And we also thank you so much for your Son, Jesus Christ, that through his sacrifice for us, we have that hope of eternal glory with you. We ask all this in his name. Amen.
Amen. All right, we are talking about David and Bathsheba tonight. Kind of in a string of sad stories here. The last time we were together, we talked about David ascending to the throne. He becomes king, but he becomes king over a nation that's divided. You might recall that Israel and Judah were divided as to who they wanted to follow. Judah, the tribe of David down in the south, embraced him as the king, as Saul's successor. But the rest of Israel followed after Abner, who was the commander of Saul's army. Abner installed Ishbosheth as the successor to Saul, even though that was against God's will. This creates a time of civil war and conflict over who will gain supremacy. Eventually, though, Abner grew weary of Ishbosheth and negotiated with David to turn the kingdom over to him completely. But as the story ends, both Abner and Ishbosheth are assassinated, and this brings David to the throne. So, a sad story, and we're going to talk about another sad story this evening. Just kind of in one of those strings here of tough lessons. I want to do just a little bit of review this evening, just to kind of remind us of where we're at. So we're looking at the books that the Jews called the former prophets. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The Jews all considered those 4 books to be the former prophets. They believed all Old Testament books were written by prophets, and that Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings were basically compilations of earlier works. We're not really sure who pieced all these together. It looks like Samuel wrote maybe the tail end of Joshua, the book of Judges, and most of 1 Samuel. But then the rest of these books were sort of compiled together by probably a later editor. Most likely the prophet Jeremiah during the era of Josiah, who was the last good king of Judah prior to the Babylonian captivity. And the Jews looked at this, at their history, as the events and actions of God working toward his eternal purpose. So I just kind of wanted to do just a quick refresher, kind of remind us where we're at. And I also want to bring up a couple of books that we're probably not going to look at a whole lot in our study. And that's the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And the reason I bring this up is I'll be referring to 1st Chronicles a few times tonight. These 2 books were written by Ezra much later on in the 5th century BC. So just to kind of give us a little bit of a timeline here, David's living in the late 1000s, early 900s BC. Jeremiah prophesied in the late 600s BC. Ezra was living in about the mid-5th century, so the mid-400s BC. All right? And he wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles as a historical account of Israel, but he did it with a whole different intention. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings focus on the history element of the children of Israel. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles have a little bit different focus. 1st Chronicles records the reign of David. Then 2nd Chronicles gets into the reigns of the kings of Judah from Solomon all the way through the Babylonian captivity. And Ezra wanted to go back through this history and offer a different narrative because he wanted to focus on a different aspect. Ezra was very interested in his time on restoring the priesthood, the liturgy, the temple worship, because these things had sort of fallen by the wayside. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written to kind of refocus the children of Israel on the temple, on the priesthood, on the worship of God, And so they're two books of history, but they're two books of history with a different thematic emphasis. And that's going to become important tonight because we're going to consult First Chronicles in a couple of instances this evening to kind of get us a little bit different angle as to what was happening in the life of David. All right, so we've been looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel. We'll be working 1st Chronicles in this evening, and that's kind of like just a 10,000-foot view of what these books are all about. So we left off in 2 Samuel 5. That was where our last study left off. And I thought we'd just kind of run through chapters 6 through 10 here real quick because there's some significant events that happen in chapters 6 through 10. In chapter 6, David brings the ark to Jerusalem. Remember, the ark had been taken into battle by the children of Israel when they fought the Philistines, right? And they lost the battle, and the ark fell into the hands of the Philistines. And you might remember, the Philistines had all kinds of trouble, right? They had possession of the ark, they were struck with all kinds of plagues and diseases, and they finally decide, let's just send the ark back to Israel. And it ends up at this place called Kirjath Jearim, which is a city, a town, on the border of Judah and Benjamin. In fact, it's kind of disputed as to which tribe it belongs to. Sometimes it says it belongs to Judah, sometimes it says it belongs to Benjamin. It's right there on the border. Now David, when he takes the ark from Kirjath Jearim to Jerusalem, makes the mistake of transporting it by cart. Now we didn't go over how the tabernacle and all the pieces of furniture in the tabernacle were put together, but God is very specific. The ark was to be carried on 2 poles by Levites from the family of Kohath. And God is very particular in his instructions. They are to carry it by poles, and no one is to touch the ark. Well, David makes the mistake of having them put the ark on a cart. And the ark begins to fall off the cart on its way to Jerusalem. And Uzzah, one of the men, one of the Levites who's responsible for transporting the ark, reaches out his hand to steady it. And as soon as he touches the ark, he dies. And this makes David at first angry, but then he becomes terrified. He's angry at first because he wants to do this good thing and take the ark to Jerusalem, but then he's like, oh yeah, this guy's dead because this is a sacred object. This is holy. God told us not to touch it. So he learns better and ends up finishing that journey at the end of chapter 6. He has it transported to Jerusalem the right way. This is one of those references to 1 Chronicles that I just wanted to bring to your attention because 1 Chronicles 15 talks about this story, but it gives a different emphasis. It gives a little different flavor than what you read in 2 Samuel chapter 6. All right, so David brings the ark to Jerusalem. In chapter 7, David's in his capital of Jerusalem. He's built a house. And it comes into his mind that he wants to build a temple to God. He shares that vision with Nathan, the prophet. Nathan that night has a dream from God, and God communicates to David through Nathan. And God gives David permission to build a temple, but he tells him, you will not be the one who builds it. I'm going to turn that responsibility over to your son. And here's another instance where 1 Chronicles can be very helpful. If we go over to 1 Chronicles 22, verses 7 through 10, David's actually talking with Solomon, who's going to build the temple, and he tells him why God would not permit David to build the temple. David tells Solomon, God wouldn't let me build this because I'm a man of war. God wanted basically to use David as a way to bring all of Israel's enemies to a place of peace, to subdue all of Israel's enemies so that the land would be at peace, and then God would use David's son Solomon to build the temple. So another instance where cross-referencing with the book of First Chronicles gives us a little different insight into the story. David's future son and successor will build a temple, and as we know, that is Solomon. So he brings the ark to Jerusalem in chapter 6. He begins making plans, at least in his mind, to build a temple for God in chapter 7. And then chapters 8 through 10 basically cover the same. They basically just cover David conquering various enemies. And essentially what we see happening in chapters 8 through 10 is David is firmly establishing himself as the king of Israel. We see his government described, the various administrations of his government are described in these chapters. And then they have kind of nestled in chapter 9 a story that I think I mentioned a few weeks ago. It's the story of Mephibosheth. And again, if anybody's looking for a sermon idea, the story of Mephibosheth is a good one.
It's been done.
Oh, whoa! Wow. When did that happen?
The very next Sunday.
Oh, wow, very good. It's a great story, isn't it? It's a beautiful story. See, there you got a positive story about David, right? I left that one for a Sunday morning for you guys. All right, yeah. It's a great story. Okay, so that's nestled right in the middle of all this. And basically, chapter 10 ends with the enemies of Israel on the run. David is sort of at the height of his powers. And then we get to chapter 11. And I think that context is really important because one of the questions that I have tried to find an answer to, and I haven't been able to find one in the text yet. I just wonder, why did David do what he did in chapters 11 and 12? And there's no real clear answer in the narrative in 2 Samuel. First Chronicles doesn't cover this story at all. I even went over to Psalm 51, which was the psalm that David wrote after he was convicted of this sin by Nathan the prophet. And David really doesn't give any indication as to why he did this. Well, I think there may be an answer in the preceding chapters leading up to chapter 11. And then the first thing that's said in chapter 11. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Now, in the previous chapters, we've seen David winning victory after victory after victory over his enemies. And the opening comment in chapter 11 is, it's the time of year when kings go out to war. But where's David? He's in Jerusalem. Why isn't he out with his men? Well, David should be out with his men, leading them in battle, and not in Jerusalem. That seems to be the implication. And what I wonder, and I'm just going to throw this out as a hypothesis, I don't know, I can't prove anything beyond the shadow of a doubt here, but I wonder if David's success, if maybe he had become perhaps a little proud. Maybe he was trusting in his own righteousness a little too much. Maybe he was overconfident. Maybe he was just feeling the effects of power. That's the best I can do. I just don't know that there's any other. I shouldn't say that. I haven't been able to find a better answer in the text. It just seems like maybe David was resting on his laurels a little too much. That perhaps he had become a little overconfident. I'll send Joab and the army out to battle. I don't need to go out there. I'm going to stay behind in Jerusalem. And that decision gets him in trouble. He sees this beautiful woman bathing on a rooftop. And, there's all kinds of speculation out there. The rabbis and their commentaries on this passage had all kinds of theories about what went down. And, was Bathsheba, did she know that David would be up at a place where he could see her at this time of day? So was she attempting to seduce him? I mean, all of that's just speculation. We just really don't know. All we do know is that David saw this woman, wanted this woman, and because he was the king, he took her for himself. And didn't really know who she was, apparently. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity. And she returned to her house, and the woman conceived. So she sent and told David and said, "I am with child." So he didn't know who she was. He finds out who she is. He finds out she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite and the daughter of Eliam. Now that's important. Let me tell you why. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 8 through 39, it lists David's mighty men. These are the 40-odd warriors that are David's finest warriors. They're the captains of his army. They are the leaders in battle. They are his most trusted soldiers. And right at the end of that list, in verse 39, is Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was an officer in David's army. He was one of the great warriors of his day. Bathsheba is the daughter of Eliam. Oh, one other thing. Yeah, Uriah is a Hittite. That's another thing I wanted you to notice, not an Israelite. The Hittites, their home territory was, everybody know where Turkey is in the Mediterranean? So the Hittites were kind of in the eastern portion of Turkey that kind of stretches down into Syria now. It's kind of that region was the Hittite home region. Okay, and by this time the Hittite people they're not the nation that they once were. They were kind of, their heyday was a little bit after the lifetime of Abraham. So they're still a culture of people, but they're not what they used to be. All right, so Uriah was a Hittite. He's not an Israelite. Bathsheba is the daughter of Eliam. And I think I've said, maybe in the past, I've suggested that maybe Bathsheba was not an Israelite. I want to go back and correct that. I did some more digging today, and it looks like she is, in fact, a Jew. So Bathsheba is the daughter of Eliam, and we learn that Eliam, in that same list of David's mighty men, Eliam is also one of David's great warriors. He's also one of the officers in David's army. Eliam is the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. Now, let me kind of piece all this together. Let me show you just how sordid an affair this really is. What we have happening here is a real act of treachery. You've got Uriah, who's an officer in David's army. Eliam, who is the father of Bathsheba, he's also an officer in David's army. And his father, the grandfather of Bathsheba, Ahithophel, was one of David's chief counselors. So David's sin with Bathsheba, and we might add against Bathsheba, because it sure looks to me like he took advantage of his position as a king. His sin embroiled him in the middle of a problem, not only with this woman and her husband, but also her father and her grandfather. All of these people are some of David's closest officers and counselors. And it just so happens that Ahithophel, father of Bathsheba, is the one who later on, when David's son Absalom tries to take the throne from his father, Ahithophel is the one who encourages that to happen. And we'll talk about some of Ahithophel's betrayals a little bit later if I can get moving a little bit faster. So this is a real act of treachery. And that's why a few weeks ago when we were talking about Saul and David and Saul's heart that was overtaken by fear, and David is a man after God's own heart, and Saul disobeyed God, and we wondered, well, what makes David different than Saul? Because David did this terrible thing with Bathsheba, and I made the comment that I think I could make the argument that David's sin was far worse than Saul's. This is why. This is why right here. I mean, David is sitting against some of his closest advisors and officers. I mean, this is a reprehensible act. I think he's taking advantage of his position as king. I think it's possible, this is just a hypothesis, that power has gotten to his head and he's taken advantage of his position. That's my read of the story. So we keep going. So David does this thing. He gets her pregnant. He gets word. He sends word to Joab. Joab is the commander of David's army. Joab is the one who killed Abner. Remember that a couple weeks ago? He sends word to Joab and says, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Now, it's not clear in this passage what's going on. But David is wanting Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife in order to cover up his sin. That's what's going on. But how did Uriah respond to this? Well, he decides, I'm not going home. I'm going to sleep right here near the king. So here we see David's first attempt to use Uriah to cover up his sin. So the servants tell David, Uriah did not go down to his house. David said to Uriah, "Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" And Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go to my house and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." I don't know, when I read this, I think to myself, that's the kind of guy I want in my army. This is a warrior's warrior right here. This is a man who, he's not interested in going home and being comforted by his wife. He's got a pass. He's been let out of the battle, and he wants none of it. Because he knows that Joab and his fellow soldiers are out in the field, and his loyalty to David runs so deep that he refuses to take any comfort for himself. So David, it gets a little worse from here. I shouldn't say a little, it gets a lot worse from here. David says to Uriah, "Wait here today also, and tomorrow I will let you depart." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now when David called him, he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. So David's next strategy is, I'll get him drunk and he'll go home and sleep with his wife. That's what David is intending to do. That's the way it looks to me. And so the next day, when David finds out that Uriah did not go home, he's tried 3 different times to get Uriah to go home and copulate with his wife so that it can appear that he's the one who got her pregnant so that David's sin will not be known. So David decides he's going to use his power in order to remove Uriah off the board completely. In the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah, and he wrote in the letter saying, he sent this letter by the hand of Uriah. I mean, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat for him so that he may be struck down and die. So it was while Joab besieged the city that he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew there were valiant men. Then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. He sent the letter by the hand of Uriah. Uriah took his own death sentence unknowingly to Joab. That's why I said earlier, it's reprehensible. Absolutely reprehensible. So David has Uriah killed. Joab reports back about Uriah's death. And David encourages Joab to continue fighting. So that's how the story comes to a conclusion in chapter 11. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Even though what David had done in secret, God fully knew what had happened. And God was going to take care of matters. And that's what brings us to chapter 12. I'll pause. Any questions or comments that make sense to everybody? You have anything you want to throw in there? Talk about the young and the restless, right? Boy, this is days of our lives. You know, it's just human beings being human beings, right? What's the old saying? Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, right? I remember reading a biography of Lyndon Johnson. It's actually my favorite series of books written by Robert Caro. And one of the observations he makes on very, very early on in those books is, absolute power does not always corrupt, but absolute power always reveals. And that's a really interesting observation. There are some people who can handle the power and it doesn't corrupt them. But almost always, anyone who's given power, you're going to learn something about that person. And that's certainly what we see in the case of David, that as laudable as David is in many respects, as good of a man as he is, this moment shows us something about him. And it's not good. It's just not good. Yeah, Jordan, go ahead. Jump on in here.
Yeah, I hope I don't derail you.
Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier about the person catching the ark dying.
Mm-hmm.
If you, maybe you could spend half a minute and expand on that, comparing that to David's sins. It seems similar to what we talked about like a month ago about Saul and David.
Mm-hmm.
So like I don't know if that would be like your answer, classifying it that way, or if there's more to that story than, I don't know.
Yeah. Why wasn't David struck dead for doing this? Yeah. It's a good question. The one distinction I would draw is we are dealing with the Ark of the Covenant. That is where the presence of God dwelt in the tabernacle, and God is very explicit in the law that it's not to be touched. For adultery, though, adultery was handled differently. People weren't struck dead for adultery. If a man committed adultery, he and the woman with whom he had committed adultery would be drug out. They would be adjudicated by the community, and if they were found guilty, they were to be stoned with stones. So the punishment was a little bit different in that respect. So I think that's the distinction between the two. Whereas you have a sacred object where the presence of God dwells, as opposed to adultery, which under the law was handled differently. And it's not handled that way with David, is it? Right? Why wasn't David stoned to death? Well, because it appears that the only witnesses to David's sin were David and Bathsheba. It's the way it looks, probably. That's my best guess. But admittedly, I know these are gray areas, and I think what one possible way of interpreting this is both of them serve God's purpose in different ways. And that's not always a satisfactory answer. But this kind of goes back to something God says in the book of Isaiah, my ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts. That sometimes the things that appear to us on the surface to be inequitable judgment, that there's some bigger purpose at work here. And that's about the best I can do with that. Does that help at all? You have any thoughts about it?
Not particularly. I just have heard the story of the Ark in the past, parallel to the New Testament and how to worship, but it's always been a conundrum to me.
Yeah.
So I don't really have anything else.
Yeah, and the only, of course, the distinction would be, the Ark was a part of worship, and what David did was not. This was something that was apart from the temple and the worship, so that does make it a little bit different, but I'm not excusing or rationalizing David's behavior in any way. I hope that's clear. Hopefully that's come across. So, all right. So another quick refresher here. We talked about this a few weeks ago when we started getting into the life of Samuel. There's not many prophets from Joshua to Samuel. We have just a few references. Deborah is called a prophetess in Judges 4. There's an unnamed prophet in Judges 6. There's an unnamed man of God in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 27. But basically, from Joshua to Samuel, we just don't see many prophets or prophetesses at all. With Samuel's appearance, though, I guess you might say the age of the prophets begins. This is the time when prophets begin playing a very prominent role. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the reason why God used prophets during this time were prophets were an independent authority that checked the excesses of monarchical power. So if you think about our Constitution, for example, whenever you go through your social studies class, 8th grade or whatever, you talk about the concept of checks and balances, right? That the legislature has certain powers to keep the executive branch in check, and vice versa, and the judicial branch keeps both the others in check, right? Well, the prophets are sort of a check to the kings. They're the ones who kind of hold the kings accountable. And that's relevant because a prophet is the one who goes to David and confronts David about his sin with Bathsheba. And Nathan very cleverly uses a parable to do it, right? He uses a parable of a rich man and a poor man, and a rich man taking advantage of his poor neighbor. And Nathan very cleverly works in the whole idea of a sheep, of a lamb, right? And that's going to appeal to David because what was he before he became a king and a great warrior? He was a shepherd. So Nathan sets him up perfectly. And David is angry. I put chapter 11 here, but it's actually chapter 12. I got those wrong. There's my first typo that I caught this evening, Chad. David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. And he shall restore fourfold for the land because he did this thing and because he had no pity." David wants to condemn this man to death for taking advantage of his neighbor. Nathan looks at David and says, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So God rebukes David. David is basically caught in hypocrisy, right? He wants this other man in Nathan's parable to be put to death. And Nathan says, that's you. You're a hypocrite. You're not seeing yourself clearly. You have taken advantage of your poor neighbor. Just as the rich man took advantage of his poor neighbor in the parable, so too David has taken advantage of his faithful servant Uriah. And God says to David, I gave you everything. I gave you your throne. I protected you from Saul. I've given you victory over your enemies. And I would have given you so much more. And this is how you treat me. And I wonder, this kind of goes back to the question that Jordan asked. Why did God spare David's life? I think God's teaching a lesson through David in this moment. That sometimes you have to suffer the consequences in this life for what you've done. Death would have been far more merciful than what David had to suffer in the ensuing chapters. And all you have to do is keep reading the story of David. And again, I think I can make an argument that death would have been preferable to what David has to go through. The punishment that David endures is far worse than being executed for his crime. That's my perspective, at least. He loses this son, this son that he conceived with Bathsheba. The son dies. His household is thrown into turmoil. He almost loses his throne to his son Absalom. And David's life basically becomes a mess. And I think the lesson is God says to him, I have given you all of these things, and what have you done? And that should speak to us that in a weak moment, in a span of 5 minutes, a bad decision can ruin the rest of your life. That, I think, is the lesson that God is driving home with David. It's a lesson we should all take to heart. All it takes is one mess up like this, and the rest of your life is irrevocably changed. There's no going back. There's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. See, Nathan goes on. He continues to tell David what God has told him. Behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before you and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this son, for you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. So David's punishment is he will have to face strife in his house. The sword shall never depart from your house. He will lose his wives to his neighbors. And if you want to know how that's fulfilled, you can read 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 20 and 21. I mentioned Ahithophel. Ahithophel is the one who advises David's son Absalom to go in to David's concubines and have relations with them, and to do it out in the public view of everyone. And this was Absalom's way of basically claiming the throne for himself. That's humiliating. David is going to be exposed to public humiliation and shame. So as I said a moment ago, David does not get off lightly. And I think I can say with a degree of certainty that death would have been preferable over living through all of this. David, to his credit, and there's not much credit to be given to David in the story except for this and something else that he says a little bit later. He does not make excuses. He just says, I have sinned against the Lord, period. He takes full responsibility, holds himself accountable for his actions. Nathan says to David, the Lord has also put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, The child also who is to be born to you shall surely die. So God spares David's life. What David did was in secret. Apparently the only witness to it was God himself, other than David and Bathsheba. That's the way, at least, I read it. God decides to spare his life, but what he has done, when it becomes known, is going to bring repute upon the nation. And I didn't look up this passage, but in the book of Deuteronomy, one thing Moses says to the children of Israel, he warns them that they need to be very careful how they conduct themselves, that they need to keep the law because they are an example to their Gentile neighbors who do not know Jehovah. And that's what God is hearkening back to when he says, you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. He's basically saying, you've made a mockery of the law, of you being the chosen people of God. You have given the enemies of Israel a reason to speak evil against you and against your nation and against the Lord himself. And that's a lesson that's worth bearing in mind, that as Paul says at the tail end of Romans chapter 2, when he's talking about the dangers of hypocrisy, he says, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. He actually quotes that from the Old Testament. And that's something that's worth bearing in mind, that as we conduct ourselves out in the world, we're showing people something about the Lord. And if that's inconsistent with what the Bible teaches, that gives people an occasion to mock Christianity, to speak evil of God and the faith. So we should be aware of how we conduct ourselves in the public forum. So David sees that this child become ill. He fasts and prays for 7 days until the child dies. He doesn't know that the child is dead. The servants are afraid to tell him, but he sees them talking and he perceives that the child is dead. So he asks, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. So David arose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. Now, this behavior really, his servants are bewildered by this behavior. They're very confused. Now, wait a second, you've been fasting and praying for 7 days, and now you're acting normal after the child is dead. Why are you acting in that way? And this is the other thing that's, I think, maybe commendable about David in this story. Other than taking full responsibility for his sin, the second thing that he says is really good. His servants said to him, what is this that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. And he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. I'm just sort of amazed at David's response here. It's like he knows, I spent these 7 days in the hopes that God would change his mind and spare this child, but the decision's been made. The child is dead. There's nothing I can do to bring him back. I can go to him, but he cannot come to me. In other words, I'm going to die, and I can go to the grave, and I will see him again, but he's not coming back to me. No amount of tears, no amount of agony is going to bring him back. And I think this is David accepting his punishment from the Lord. He's accepting the chastening of the Lord, and what a bitter, bitter pill to swallow. As I said, death might have been preferable in comparison to this sort of thing. Any questions or comments about the story? That's kind of it's a real downer, isn't it? It's just a really sad story, tragic story. Questions, comments? Chad, is that a scratch or a hand?
It's a scratch.
That's a scratch. All right. Well, I think we'll close there for tonight. And let's see. What's our story for next week? Anybody got it? I haven't.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Yeah, we have Thanksgiving next Thursday night. Are you planning to cancel service, Chad?
We're canceling service.
Okay. Canceling service for Thanksgiving next week. 2 weeks. What's lesson 51?
Solomon becomes king.
Solomon becomes king. That's a little bit better story. Yeah, a little bit more positive. So, anything as we close? Well, let's sing a song as we close this evening. Let's stand and sing number 605. 605, and if there's anyone we can help, either restore to the church or come to faith in Jesus Christ, we ask you to let your needs be known. Just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, just as I am, and waiting not to rid my soul of one dark blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot, O Lamb of God, I come, just as I am, thou wilt receive with pardon, cleanse, relief, because thy promise I believe.